There's a question that hovers at the edges of human consciousness, unspoken but always present, threading through every civilization that has ever existed. Why do we fear death? Not just the pain of dying, not just the grief of losing others, but the fundamental existential terror that one day we will simply cease to be. That all we've built, all we've loved, all we've learned will dissolve into nothing. It's a fear so universal that we rarely examine it directly. We just live with it, build around it, create entire belief systems to soften its edges. But here's something strange. This fear might not have always been part of the human condition, and if certain ancient texts are to be believed, if we take seriously what the oldest written records actually say, our relationship with death, our awareness of mortality itself, might have been introduced at a specific moment in our history by beings the Mesopotamians called the Anunnaki. Now before we go further, let me be clear about what we're discussing. The Anunnaki were deities in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian mythology, part of a complex pantheon that the people of ancient Mesopotamia worshipped and revered. They appear throughout thousands of clay tablets spanning millennia, described as powerful beings who shaped human destiny, who gave kingship, who taught civilization. Whether they were literal beings, symbolic representations of natural forces, ancestral memories of advanced humans, or something else entirely remains one of history's great questions. What matters for our exploration tonight is not proving what they were, but understanding what the myths about them reveal about humanity's earliest confrontations with the concept of death. The oldest written story we possess, older than Homer, older than Genesis, older than any Chinese or Indian text that survives in written form, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and at its heart, driving every action of its hero is an obsessive, desperate, ultimately futile quest for immortality. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human according to the text, witnesses the death of his beloved friend Enkidu and is shattered by it. Not just grieving, but fundamentally broken by the realization that he too will die, that his power, his divinity, his accomplishments mean nothing against the finality of death. So he sets out on a journey to find Utnapishtim, the one human granted immortality by the gods after surviving the Great Flood. He crosses mountains guarded by scorpion beings. He traverses the waters of death. He nearly dies of exhaustion and despair. All of this driven by one desperate question: how can I escape death? When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, the ancient flood survivor tells him the truth that will echo through human history. You can't. The gods keep immortality for themselves. They made humanity mortal deliberately. Death is built into you by design. Think about that for a moment. Not death as a natural consequence of biology, not death as an unfortunate side effect of living in physical bodies, but death as an intentional feature installed by the creators, the Anunnaki. The text is explicit about this. When the gods created humanity, when Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag mixed clay with divine blood and fashioned the first humans, they made a choice. Humans would be mortal, humans would die. And not just that humans would know they were going to die, would live with that knowledge hanging over every moment of existence. This is profoundly different from how we think about death now. We assume mortality is just how biological organisms work. Cells divide, DNA degrades, systems break down, death is inevitable. But the Mesopotamian texts suggest something else. They suggest that mortality is not inevitable, that the gods themselves are immortal, that immortality exists, that it's achievable, but that it was specifically withheld from humanity. We were made to die, and more than that, we were made to know we're going to die. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest versions of the flood story predating the biblical account by over 1,000 years, lays this out with disturbing clarity. The gods create humans to be workers, to perform the labor the junior gods no longer want to do. But the humans multiply too quickly, become too numerous, too noisy. The chief god Enlil can't sleep because of all the human commotion, so he decides to destroy them. First with plague, then with drought, then with famine, and finally with the Great Flood. But Enki, the god of wisdom who had helped create humanity in the first place, warns one man, Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. Build a boat, save yourself and your family, preserve the animals, the flood comes, everything is destroyed, and when the gods realize what they've done, wiped out their entire workforce, They regret it. They need humans, but they can't have them multiplying out of control again, so they make a new agreement. Humanity can continue, but with population controls built in. The text specifies what these controls are. 1/3 of births will fail, some women will be barren, there will be demons who cause miscarriages, and there will be death. Not just occasional death from accidents or disease, but systematic mortality, lifespans deliberately limited. This isn't mythology in the sense of made-up stories. This is mythology in the sense of encoded cultural memory, of ancient peoples trying to explain why things are the way they are. And what they're explaining is that death wasn't always part of the human experience, or at least not death as we know it. That there was a before and an after. That something changed, something was imposed, something was added to the human condition. The Sumerian King List, that fascinating and frustrating document that historians struggle to interpret, records this transition. Before the flood, it lists 8 kings with impossibly long reigns. King Alalim ruled for 28,800 years. King Alalngar ruled for 36,000 years. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven again, but the reign lengths are shorter. First thousands of years, then hundreds, then eventually numbers that match known historical records and human lifespans. Scholars debate endlessly what this means. Are these symbolic numbers encoding astronomical cycles? Are they dynasties rather than individual reigns? Are they using a different time unit that later scribes misunderstood? Or are they preserving memory of a time when human lifespans were genuinely different, when death worked differently, before the Anunnaki imposed the limitations we now live with? The biblical tradition preserves this same pattern. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. Noah lived 950 years. Then after the flood, lifespans declined steadily. Abraham lived 175 years. Moses lived 120 years. By the time of King David, we're at normal. Human lifespans, 70 or 80 years, exactly what we see today. 2 separate traditions, Mesopotamian and Hebrew, both recording the same essential story. There was a time when humans lived far longer, and then after a great catastrophe, after a flood, lifespans shortened dramatically. This convergence is either remarkable coincidence or it's both cultures preserving memory of something real that happened. But let's return to Gilgamesh, because his story gets to the heart of what the fear of death actually means. Utnapishtim tells him that there is a plant at the bottom of the ocean, a plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves it, and begins the journey home, believing he's finally achieved what he sought. But while he's bathing in a pool, a serpent steals the plant. The serpent sheds its skin and is renewed, while Gilgamesh is left mortal, aging, doomed to die. The symbolism here is devastating. Even when humans briefly touch immortality, it's taken from us. Even when we find the secret, we lose it. The serpent, that ancient symbol appearing in mythologies worldwide, possesses what we cannot have, the ability to renew itself, to shed death and continue. While we, made by gods who chose to make us mortal, must accept our fate. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk defeated. The text ends not with him achieving immortality, but with him accepting mortality. He looks at the walls of his city, the great walls he built, and realizes that this is his immortality. Not his body continuing forever, but his works enduring, his name being remembered, his deeds surviving in story and stone after his body returns to dust. This, the text suggests, is what the Anunnaki gave us in exchange for immortality, legacy, the possibility that though we die, something of us continues. Our children carry our blood, our works outlast our bodies, our stories are told by those who come after. It's a consolation prize, a compromise, but it's what we have, and this is where the fear of death begins. Because if death is inevitable, if it's built into us by design, then suddenly everything changes. Every moment becomes precious because there are only so many. Every relationship carries the shadow of eventual loss. Every achievement is temporary because we won't be here to maintain it. The awareness of mortality transforms human existence from something eternal into something urgent, desperate, meaningful, precisely because it ends. The Mesopotamians understood this. Their texts are filled with meditations on death, with prayers against death, with desperate attempts to postpone death through magic and ritual. They built elaborate tombs. They developed beliefs about the afterlife, the underworld realm ruled by Ereshkigal where the dead dwell in shadow. They created priesthoods dedicated to maintaining offerings for the deceased. They believed that even after death, the spirits of ancestors needed to be remembered, fed, honoured, or they would suffer. This is fear of death expressing itself in culture, in religion, in architecture. The ziggurats rising toward heaven, perhaps attempting to reach the realm of the immortal Anunnaki. The elaborate burial practices ensuring the dead had what they needed in the next world. The epic poetry like Gilgamesh ensuring that names and deeds would survive when bodies could not. But there's something deeper here, something the texts hint at, but don't fully explain. If the Anunnaki made humanity mortal deliberately, if death was a design choice rather than a biological inevitability, why? What purpose does human mortality serve? The text suggests several answers. Control. Mortal humans are easier to manage than immortal ones. If you live forever, you have infinite time to accumulate knowledge, power, resources. You become a rival to the gods themselves. But if you only live 70 or 80 years, you never accumulate enough of anything to challenge the established order. Each generation starts over, learning the same lessons, making the same mistakes, dying before they can achieve true power. Population control. The Atrahasis makes this explicit. Humans were multiplying too fast, becoming too numerous. Mortality ensures that birth rates and death rates eventually balance. No matter how many children are born, death culls the population, keeps the numbers manageable. Meaning. This is perhaps the darkest possibility, the one the texts gesture toward but don't quite state explicitly. If death creates urgency, if mortality makes life meaningful precisely because it ends, then perhaps the Anunnaki made us mortal, not to control us, but to give us something they themselves lack. Purpose. Think about it. If you live forever, nothing matters. You have infinite time to do everything, to experience everything, to learn everything. There's no reason to do anything today because you can always do it tomorrow, or 1,000 years from tomorrow. Actions lose consequence, relationships lose intensity, achievement loses meaning. The Anunnaki, according to the text, spent their time in endless councils, endless debates, endless political maneuvering. They created humans partly out of boredom, partly to avoid labour, but maybe also because they needed something with stakes, something that mattered because it wouldn't last forever. This interpretation finds support in how the gods react to human mortality in the myths. They're not indifferent to it, they're fascinated by it. When the flood comes and the gods realize they're about to destroy all humanity, several of them weep. The goddess Ishtar laments, "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I order battle to destroy my people?" Even Enlil, who ordered the destruction, seems disturbed by its totality once it's complete. The gods need humans, not just as workers, but as something more, as beings who matter because they die, whose choices have weight because they can't be undone, whose brief lives burn with an intensity the eternal gods cannot experience. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods create Enkidu specifically to befriend Gilgamesh, to civilize him through companionship. They create a mortal being to teach their semi-divine king how to be human. The relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, between the two-thirds divine king and the fully mortal wild man, becomes the emotional core of the entire epic. And it's Enkidu's death that transforms Gilgamesh, that teaches him what mortality means, that sends him on his quest. The gods watch this. They observe human grief, human love, human desperation in the face of death. And perhaps they learn something from it, something they cannot experience directly because they do not die. But let's step back from mythology for a moment and consider the historical context. The texts we're discussing, the Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian King List. These emerge from Mesopotamia between roughly 2700 and 1700 BCE. This is the world's first literate civilization, the first to develop writing, the first to build cities, the first to create complex legal codes and administrative systems. These weren't primitive people telling simple stories around campfires. These were sophisticated urban cultures with mathematics, astronomy, literature, philosophy. And what were they obsessed with? Death. Not survival, not subsistence, not the daily struggle for food and shelter that had occupied humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. No, they had agriculture, they had surplus, they had leisure time. And what did they do with it? They contemplated mortality. They wrote about death, built monuments to death, created elaborate mythologies explaining death. The cities themselves reflect this obsession. Ur, Uruk, Babylon, these weren't just settlements. They were statements against mortality. Stone temples that would last millennia, written records preserving names and deeds, elaborate tombs for kings and priests. The entire civilization was a massive project aimed at creating something that would outlast individual human lives, something permanent in the face of mortality. The Mesopotamians invented writing around 3200 BCE, and within a few hundred years they're using it not just for accounting and administration, but for literature, for recording stories, for preserving memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists because someone, multiple someones, decided that this story about mortality needed to be written down, copied, preserved, passed forward. They believed, correctly as it turns out, that writing could defeat death in a way physical bodies could not. Gilgamesh the man died 4,000 years ago, if he was real at all. But Gilgamesh the character, Gilgamesh the story, still lives. We still read his words, still follow his journey, still feel his grief. This is what the Anunnaki gave us along with mortality. The knowledge that though we die, meaning can survive. Stories persist, names endure, works outlast their makers. It's cold comfort, perhaps, not the same as actually living forever, but it's something, and it's what every civilization since has grasped at. This idea that we can build monuments, write books, create art, have children, do something, anything that will continue after we're gone. But here's what's deeply unsettling about all this. The Mesopotamian texts don't present mortality as natural. They present it as artificial, as imposed, as a condition added to humanity after we were created. The Enki and Ninmah text describes the creation of the first humans, and there's no mention of death in the initial design. Death comes later, as a modification, as one of the population control mechanisms the gods install after humanity multiplies too rapidly. What does it mean if death isn't natural? What does it mean if mortality is something done to us rather than something inherent in us? It means our fear of death might be justified. It means we might be right to rage against death, to seek ways to extend life, to dream of immortality. Because death isn't a law of nature, it's a choice made by our creators, and choices can be unmade. This is speculation now, moving into territory where history and mythology blur into questions we can't definitively answer. But it's speculation the ancient Mesopotamians themselves engaged in. The Epic of Gilgamesh asks explicitly whether death can be overcome. The answer the text gives is no, at least not through the methods Gilgamesh attempts. The plant of immortality exists but cannot be kept by humans. The secret of eternal life belongs to Utnapishtim but cannot be transferred. The gods alone possess true immortality, and they guard it jealously. Yet the very existence of these stories, the fact that Gilgamesh searches for immortality rather than simply accepting death, suggests that the Mesopotamians believed death was something that could potentially be challenged, questioned, perhaps even defeated under the right circumstances. They didn't view mortality as the natural order, they viewed it as an imposed order, which meant it had boundaries, rules, possible exceptions. The cities of Mesopotamia rose along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, drawing life from the annual floods that deposited rich silt across the floodplains. The people who built these cities, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, they understood cycles. The river flooded and receded. Crops grew and died and grew again. Seasons turned. Kings ruled and died and were replaced by their heirs. Everything cycled except the gods. The Anunnaki stood outside the cycle, eternal, unchanging, watching humanity spin through its brief generations. And watching must have been strange. Imagine being immortal, observing a species that lives and dies within the span of time you might spend deliberating a single decision. You watch a child born, grow, learn, love, age, die, all in what for you is barely a moment. Their entire life, everything they experience, all their joy and suffering, compressed into an instant from your perspective. What would that do to your understanding of existence? Would you envy them their intensity? Would you pity them their brevity? Would you even be able to comprehend what it means to know you're going to die? The myths suggest the gods struggled with this. They created humans mortal. but they also occasionally granted immortality to specific individuals. Utnapishtim and his wife, survivors of the flood, were made immortal as a reward. Ziusudra in the earlier Sumerian version was granted eternal life and taken to Dilmun, a paradise at the edge of the world. A few priests and kings were said to be taken bodily into heaven rather than dying. These exceptions prove the rule. Immortality is possible, but it's not for most of us. It's reserved for special cases, for those who serve the gods exceptionally well, for flood survivors and legendary heroes. This must have been maddening for ordinary people. Knowing that immortality exists, that some humans have achieved it, but that you personally never will. It's different from believing everyone dies with no exceptions, that you can accept as fate. But knowing there are exceptions, knowing that theoretically you could live forever but in practice you won't, that's where fear becomes something sharper. That's where acceptance becomes impossible. And perhaps that's the real origin of humanity's fear of death. Not just that we die, but that we know we die while knowing it doesn't have to be this way. The Anunnaki made us mortal deliberately. They could have made us immortal, they chose not to, and we live with that knowledge, that awareness that our death sentences were written into us by beings who themselves do not die. We'll continue this exploration in the next section, moving deeper into how this ancient understanding of death shaped everything that followed, how it influenced not just Mesopotamian culture but the entire development of human civilization as we know it. For now, let the weight of this settle. We are beings made to die by beings who do not die, and we know it. That knowledge, preserved in the oldest stories humanity ever wrote down, might be the true beginning of our fear of death. The question that haunts these ancient texts, the question they circle around but never quite answer directly, is whether the Anunnaki were right to make us mortal. Whether death, for all its terror, serves a function we couldn't achieve otherwise. Whether immortal humans would still be human in any meaningful sense. The Mesopotamians seem to believe the answer was no. That mortality defines humanity. That we are what we are precisely because we die. The very word they used for humans in Sumerian, Lu, carries connotations of mortality, of clay, of earthbound existence in contrast to the divine. To be human is to be mortal. To be mortal is to be human. The two concepts are inseparable in their language and thought. This shows up everywhere in their literature. When Enkidu is civilized, when he transforms from wild man into human, one of the key moments is when he learns he will die. The harlot who civilizes him tells him about death, about mortality, and this knowledge completes his transformation. He becomes fully human not when he learns to wear clothes or eat bread or live in cities, but when he accepts that his life has an end. Death awareness is what separates humans from animals in this framework. Animals die, but they don't know they're going to die. They live purely in the present. Humans know, and that knowledge changes everything. It creates time consciousness. If you're going to die, then time matters. You have to decide how to use your limited days. You can't do everything, so you must choose what matters most. This is what philosophers later called being toward death. The idea that awareness of mortality structures all human decision-making and gives life its shape and meaning. It creates legacy consciousness. If you're going to die but your works might survive, then what you create takes on enormous importance. The Mesopotamian kings understood this deeply. Hammurabi didn't just create a law code, he had it carved in stone and placed in temples so it would endure after his death. Every brick in the walls of Babylon was stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name. Every cylinder seal, every inscription, every monument was an attempt to cheat death through memory, to ensure the name lived on even when the body failed. It creates meaning consciousness. If life is finite, if there are only so many sunrises you'll see, so many conversations you'll have, so many moments you'll experience, then each one becomes precious. The Mesopotamians built their entire ethical and religious systems around this. How you lived mattered because you only got one life. What you did echoed into eternity, into the underworld where the dead dwelt, where your spirit would be, judged by how you were remembered. But they also recognized the burden this creates. The descent of Ishtar, one of the most powerful Mesopotamian myths, describes the goddess Ishtar traveling to the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. As Ishtar passes through each of the 7 gates, she must remove one piece of clothing, one piece of power, until she arrives naked and powerless before her sister. Ereshkigal kills her, hangs her corpse on a hook, and leaves her to rot. While Ishtar is in the underworld, all fertility on earth ceases. Nothing grows, nothing reproduces, life itself stops. The gods panic and send a messenger to retrieve her. Ereshkigal agrees to release Ishtar, but only if someone takes her place. Ishtar returns to life, to the upper world. But when she finds her husband, Dumuzi has not mourned her properly. She designates him as her replacement. He's dragged to the underworld while Ishtar lives. This myth captures something essential about the Mesopotamian understanding of death. It's not just an ending, it's an exchange. Life requires death. Fertility requires sacrifice. For one being to live, another must die. The cycle is maintained through substitution. And even the gods are subject to this. Even divine Ishtar must strip herself bare and face death. Even she cannot avoid the underworld forever. For mortal humans, this means something profound. Your death isn't just your personal ending, it's part of a larger pattern, a cosmic balance. You die so others can live. Your body returns to earth and becomes soil that feeds plants, that feed animals, that feed humans. Your death makes space for new life, new generations, new possibilities. Without death, everything would stagnate. The world would fill up with beings who never change, never make room, never allow for renewal. This is a kind of comfort, perhaps. Not immortality, but participation in something eternal. The individual dies, but the pattern continues. Life persists, even as lives end. The Mesopotamians expressed this through their agricultural festivals, their New Year celebrations where the king symbolically died and was reborn, representing the cycle of seasons of life and death and renewal that sustained their civilization. But comfort or not, it doesn't eliminate the fear. The underworld in Mesopotamian belief was not a pleasant place. It was dark, dusty, where the dead ate clay and drank dirty water, where they existed as shadows of their former selves. The only way to improve your condition in the underworld was to be remembered by the living, to have descendants who made offerings, who spoke your name, who kept your memory alive. This created an enormous pressure on the living. You had to have children to remember you. You had to accomplish something worth remembering. You had to build, create, achieve, do something that would survive. Otherwise, you faced not just physical death, but complete erasure, total oblivion in the underworld, forgotten by the living and therefore suffering eternally in the realm of the dead. The fear of being forgotten might actually be deeper than the fear of death itself. Death is inevitable, but being forgotten is not. You can do something about that. You can build monuments, write your story, have children, create works that last. The entire civilization of Mesopotamia can be understood as a massive collective effort to avoid being forgotten, to ensure that names and deeds would survive even as bodies returned to clay. And it worked. We're still talking about them 4,000 years later. We know the names of their kings, their poets, their gods. We read their stories, study their laws, excavate their cities. They achieved what they sought. They defeated oblivion even though they couldn't defeat death. The Anunnaki, if they existed, if they were real in any sense, gave humanity mortality but also the tools to transcend it through legacy, through memory, through story. Perhaps this is the real gift hidden inside the curse. Mortal beings who know they're mortal become driven in ways immortal beings never are. They create urgently, love intensely, build permanently, write enduringly. The Anunnaki created humans to be workers, but by making us mortal, they accidentally created something more. They created a species obsessed with meaning, with legacy, with transcendence. A species that would build civilizations precisely because we know we won't live to see them completed. A species that would write epics about the fear of death, and thereby conquer death through literature. Gilgamesh failed to achieve physical immortality, but his story is immortal. The real Gilgamesh, if he existed, died probably around 2700 BCE. His body is dust, but his name lives, his grief lives, his quest lives. Every person who reads the epic experiences his fear of death alongside him, and in doing so, Gilgamesh lives again. The Anunnaki made us mortal, but they also made us storytellers. And stories, unlike bodies, can be immortal. This pattern extends beyond Mesopotamia. The Egyptian pyramids are monuments against death, attempting to preserve the pharaoh's body and spirit forever. The Chinese terracotta warriors are an army meant to serve the emperor in the afterlife, ensuring his power continues beyond death. The Greek hero cults worshipped deceased warriors and kings, keeping their memory alive through ritual and sacrifice. The Christian promise of eternal life through resurrection directly addresses the fear of death by promising it can be overcome through faith. Every religion, every philosophy, every cultural system humanity has developed includes some response to mortality. Buddhism teaches that death is an illusion, that the self is illusory, that we can achieve liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Hinduism presents reincarnation, the soul returning in new forms across multiple lifetimes. Islam promises paradise for the faithful, eternal life in gardens of pleasure. Judaism emphasizes living on through descendants and good deeds. Indigenous cultures around the world develop elaborate beliefs about ancestor spirits, about the dead remaining present and active in the lives of the living. These are all variations on the same theme the Mesopotamians first explored in writing. Death is terrifying, but perhaps it doesn't have to mean complete ending. Perhaps something survives. Perhaps we can find ways to continue even after the body fails. Perhaps the Anunnaki didn't give us mortality without also giving us the means to transcend it, not physically but spiritually, culturally, through memory and meaning. Modern humans still grapple with these same questions. We've developed technologies the Mesopotamians couldn't imagine, antibiotics that prevent premature death, surgeries that extend life, treatments that postpone the inevitable. We've mapped the human genome, understanding the genetic code that underlies our biology, where developing artificial intelligence, uploading human knowledge into systems that don't die. We're even experimenting with radical life extension, trying to hack aging itself, to slow or stop the cellular processes that lead to death. Are we trying to undo what the Anunnaki did? Are we attempting to reclaim the immortality that was withheld from us? Or are we simply following the path the Mesopotamians began, finding ever more sophisticated ways to extend life, preserve memory, defeat oblivion, even if we can't defeat death itself? The transhumanist movement explicitly aims for immortality through technology. Upload consciousness to computers, replace failing organs with mechanical parts, cure aging at the cellular level, become posthuman, transcend biological limitations, achieve what Gilgamesh sought 4,000 years ago. The language has changed. We don't speak of gods and divine plants anymore. We speak of telomeres and neural networks and genetic engineering, but the goal is identical: escape death, live forever, overcome the limitation imposed on us at our creation. Whether we'll succeed remains to be seen. Every previous generation has failed. The Mesopotamian kings who built eternal monuments are dust. The Egyptian pharaohs in their inviolable pyramids are dust. The Chinese emperors surrounded by their terracotta armies are dust. The pattern holds across millennia. Everyone dies. No technology, no magic, no prayer has yet changed that fundamental fact. But perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps the point isn't whether we can achieve physical immortality, but whether we should want to. The Mesopotamians, for all their fear of death, recognize something important. Mortality creates meaning. Limitation creates value. If you have infinite time, nothing matters. But if your time is finite, everything matters. How you spend your days, who you love, what you create, what you leave behind, these become crucial questions precisely because you won't be here forever to fix mistakes or try again. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends with acceptance. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, defeated in his quest for immortality, and looks at the walls of his city. Survey the foundations, examine the brickwork, the text says. See if its brickwork is not of burnt brick, and if the 7 masters did not lay its foundations. 1 square mile is city, 1 square mile is orchards, 1 square mile is clay pits, a half square mile is the temple of Ishtar, 3.5 square miles is the area of Uruk. This is what remains when the quest for immortality fails. Not eternal life, but works that endure. Not divine status, but human achievement. Not escape from death, but acceptance of it and determination to make the time we have meaningful. The walls of Uruk stood for over 2,000 years. They're ruins now, but we still know about them. We still read about Gilgamesh who built them. The name survives. The story survives. And perhaps that's enough. The Anunnaki, whether they were gods or advanced beings or symbolic representations of forces beyond human understanding, made us mortal. They gave us death and the knowledge that we die. This might be the cruelest gift possible, Or it might be the most profound, because with mortality comes meaning, with death comes urgency, with finitude comes the possibility of legacy, of creating something that matters because it was made by beings who knew they wouldn't last forever, but tried to make something that would. We are still, 4,000 years after these texts were written, wrestling with the same questions, still fearing death, still seeking immortality or at least understanding, still building monuments and writing stories and having children and doing everything we can to ensure something of us survives. The Mesopotamians understood that this struggle, this tension between mortality and the desire for immortality, is what defines human existence. We are the beings who know we die and refuse to accept it. We are the beings who build civilizations in defiance of death. Perhaps the Anunnaki knew what they were doing when they made us this way. Perhaps they understood that a mortal being aware of its mortality would become something remarkable, something that could create meaning from limitation, beauty from brevity, immortality from mortality through the alchemy of art and memory and love. Perhaps they looked at what they'd created, these humans who knew they would die but refused to live as if that was all that mattered, and saw that it was good. Or perhaps, as the myths sometimes suggest, even the Anunnaki don't fully understand what they created. Perhaps we surprised them. Perhaps we exceeded their design specifications. Perhaps by giving us mortality and the awareness of it, they accidentally gave us something they themselves lack. The drive to make every moment count, to create urgently, to love fiercely, to build monuments that will outlast our brief lives. Perhaps they made us mortal, but we made ourselves eternal through what we do with the time we have. The clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia still exist, housed in museums, studied by scholars, translated and read by people across the world. The scribes who pressed those cuneiform characters into wet clay 4,000 years ago are long dead. Their bodies returned to Earth millennia ago, but their words survive, their thoughts survive, their fears and hopes and questions about death and immortality survive. They achieved what Gilgamesh could not through finding a magical plant or bargaining with the gods, but through the simple act of writing their stories down and passing them forward, through believing that words could outlast bodies, through trusting that future generations would care about the struggles of those long dead. They were right to trust. We do care. We do remember. We do keep their memory alive. And perhaps that's the answer to the question we started with. Were the Anunnaki the beginning of humanity's fear of death? Perhaps they were, if we take the myths literally. They made us mortal and made us aware of it. But more importantly, they also gave us the tools to transcend death, not physically, but spiritually. Language, writing, story, memory, legacy. These are the gifts that make mortality bearable. These are what allow us to live on even after we die. Every human who has ever lived has faced the same fate. We are born, we live, we die. This hasn't changed in all of human history, but what we do with the time between birth and death, how we fill those years, what we leave behind, that varies infinitely. Some people are forgotten within a generation, others are remembered for millennia. The difference isn't length of life but depth of living, not avoiding death, but making life meaningful despite its inevitable end. The ancient Mesopotamians understood this. Their myths about the Anunnaki and human mortality weren't just stories, they were teachings, wisdom passed down about how to live as mortal beings in a world that sometimes feels designed for immortals. Accept that you will die. Understand that death gives life its meaning. Create something that will outlast you. Love people while you have them. Build works that will endure. Write your story so it can be remembered. Live in such a way that your name deserves to survive. 4,000 years later, we're still learning these lessons, still trying to understand what it means to be mortal, still fearing death and seeking meaning despite it. The questions haven't changed, only the vocabulary has shifted. We don't speak of Anunnaki anymore, we speak of evolution and biology and philosophy. But we're asking the same questions, seeking the same understanding, wrestling with the same fundamental terror and wonder of being alive, being conscious, being aware that we exist but won't exist forever. So were the Anunnaki the beginning of humanity's fear of death? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were the beginning of humanity's understanding that death, for all its terror, is what makes life precious. That mortality creates meaning, that limitation creates value, that knowing we die is what allows us to truly live. The fear and the meaning are inseparable, two sides of the same gift or curse, depending on how we choose to see it. The ancient texts don't give us easy answers. They give us questions worth sitting with, worth contemplating, worth passing forward to the next generation as they were passed to us. How should we live knowing we'll die? What makes a life meaningful when life is finite? How do we create something that will outlast us? How do we face death without being paralyzed by fear of it? These questions matter as much now as they did when the scribes of Mesopotamia first pressed them into clay. Perhaps more, because we have even more power to extend life, to postpone death, to create lasting works. But we still haven't solved the fundamental problem. We still die, we still fear it, we still seek immortality or at least understanding, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe the fear of death is what drives us to create civilizations, write epics, build monuments, love deeply, live fully. Maybe the Anunnaki, if they existed, knew exactly what they were doing when they made us mortal but aware. They created beings who would never be satisfied with mere existence, who would always reach for something more, something eternal, even knowing we can never fully grasp it. We are the children of that decision, whether it was made by gods or by evolution, or by some force we don't yet understand. We are mortal beings aware of our mortality, and that awareness is both our burden and our gift. It drives us to madness and to greatness. It makes us fear death and cherish life. It makes us human. What do you think happens when we die? What do you hope survives of you? These aren't just philosophical questions, they're the questions that shaped civilization itself, that built cities and wrote epics and created everything humans have ever accomplished. The Mesopotamians asked them 4,000 years ago. We ask them still. And perhaps our descendants will ask them 4,000 years from now, reading our words as we read those ancient tablets, wondering what we understood about mortality and meaning and the strange, beautiful burden of being alive.